Hey everybody, this is Alzarath, and welcome to Deck Breakdown. Today we're breaking down a deck of Moonstalker by Raphael Majere. Now, some of you may recognize that name as the writer of the $20 guide. Yes, that is the guide to give you a decent collection of cards as well as the ability to build a deck in his thread. And I'm going to be trying to review most, if not all, of his decks eventually. And yeah, I know it's been a while since I did a deck breakdown, but I think I can still pull them off. I do plan to cover some other decks besides just this over the next few weeks, but I will also be testing these specific decks and giving you a rundown of how they work. Now, the way this is going to differ from most of my deck breakdowns is I'm not going to be pointing out things that could be changed in the deck. Instead, I'm going to try and point out the strengths and weaknesses of the deck and the direction you can go with it in the future, possibly. Now, there are a few directions that Moonstalker can go from this, but I like the fact that this deck is actually a traditional Moonstalker rather than the accursed Millstalker, which you'll never find on my channel. The core of this is just basically you bring out allies and you throw in a few big stompers in the Plasma Behemoth and the Shadow Knight, and you usually run the lighter allies to kind of decoy a little bit. And this deck has some fairly decent ally control. Now, where this deck tends to fall a little bit short is in dealing with enemies who deal a lot of direct damage or things that feed off of your allies, such as Gwen being a major threat. So you kind of got to watch out for mages and for Gwen. Just straight up Gwen. Because they will hurt you pretty bad, and it also doesn't do exceptionally well against Millstalkers, though it can surprisingly survive thanks to the amount of indirect damage that you have due to Death Mage and Plasma Behemoth. But this is true of pretty much any ally-based Shadow deck because these are very strong cards. The Shadow Knight is another reason that this deck is strong. It provides a recursor. But anyway, let's go ahead and look down the list. We'll go from the front to the back with this deck explaining what each card is there for. Now, obviously, if you're going allies on Shadow side, you're going to have Infernal Gargoyles. These are hands down the best 3-drop in Call of the Crystals. Not so 100% best drop in Dark Prophecies, but in this setup, they are definitely your choice there. That's your kind of workhorse card. It can survive a lot, and it's kind of annoying to try and remove because you need to deal 5 damage to it in one blow to kill it without it having a chance to counter or survive. The Plasma Behemoth is here as your big, meaty stomper. It's going to be coming out mid to late game and serve as essentially just a 7 damage threat that the enemy has to deal with, giving your Gargoyles and your Thaddeus a little more time to squirrel about and take down an opponent. Now, you kind of want to watch out for board wipes with them because they're kind of hard to replace as far as damage output goes. They are easily your biggest threat on the board. Now, we'll move on down to the Thaddeus. The Thaddeus is in this deck for kind of ping damage, and it's also a good indirect damage source for dealing with things such as a rogue's little unable to be touched ally. I'm forgetting his name all of a sudden. I'll have to look that one up again later. Surprising how much I play my turnaround deck and I forget the name of my little ally there. Onto the Shadow Knight. This is kind of a really good setup for this deck because of your ability to hide. You can drop a Shadow Knight and start the recursor of Shadow Knight, so you have that cycle going, and it deals a decent amount of damage readily. It's got a 5 damage attack. It only has 4 durability, meaning it is a little easier to remove with enemy spells and abilities, so you kind of have to watch out for that. But the fact that you're cycling it will waste enemy resources, and it also works well with your draw engine in this deck. Now, we're going to go ahead and just kind of lump the control into one. That is going to be the Now You're Mine and the Captured Prey. These, I personally prefer the Captured Prey. I use it a lot whenever I'm playing Wolven. It is hands down the strongest control card. I'll go ahead and pop it up for you. The Captured Prey effect is that it will essentially remove any abilities the enemy has. It shuts them down completely. There is no other card in the game that is quite so potent in completely stopping any effective use of an ally. So Captured Prey is a strong attachment and definitely worth including in pretty much any Wolven deck, and that's one of the reasons I'm willing to bet it's a 4 often here. It's one of those auto-includes for Wolvens. We're going to go ahead and look at one of the allies, the Pack Wolf. That's just kind of your 2-drop. It's sacrificable. If you get all 4 of them out, they deal some decent damage, though. On the Now You're Mine front, though, for control, you have the ability to remove a lot of low creatures. And this is one reason why I'm going to direct you whenever I get to the point of where you can advance with this. I'm going to opt to get rid of the Pack Wolves instead of the Now You're Mines, because they are just as potent as any turn 2 or 3 drop, because they basically transfer 1 card for 1 card, removing a threat, and are really strong against enemies such as the Aldens. It's good for dealing with Pewins. It's still good for dealing with Jasmines especially. But we're going to go ahead and move on. We've got the one-off here, which is the What Big Teeth. Now, I don't use it that often. It is a good kind of like lucky drop, but it's not a cornerstone of the deck, and I think it's good that it's included in here because it teaches you how to use your hero a little bit more offensively rather than just being a shadow energy kind of launcher, which is the strategy in a lot of other decks right now. It gives you that full rounded effect of, hey, my hero can fight too. We're going to go ahead and move on to Shriek, which is essentially removal for lower cost cards, and it's kind of a standard include in generic decks that are meant to deal with a lot of stuff, which this deck is. It's meant to deal with kind of a broad range of enemy decks. It's not going to really stand out against any particular one, but it's also not going to lose horribly to most of them. This is paired up with the Leyline Nexus. The Leyline Nexus takes care of the larger artifacts, while the Shriek takes care of the smaller ones. If we move on to Shadow Font, this is your kind of card for boosting your shadow ability. It lets you utilize your hide advantage, which is Moonstalker's primary ability. I'll go ahead and load him up real quick so you can read that. Basically, he causes all your allies to have stealth. And the Shadow Font, which adds to your shadow energy, basically allows you to drop one kind of as a surprise to mess up the enemy's tempo whenever they're trying to deal with your allies. Sacrificial Lamb is good for getting rid of allies or trying to dig for certain cards in this deck. The inclusion of 2 of them is fairly standard, considering it sets up for the 6 draw engine sort of rule of thumb, because this also has a double effect. Let's say you have a Infernal Gargoyle with Crippling Blow on it. It can't attack, it can't do anything. And you have Wrath of the Forest out. If you sack Lamb that, you will gain 4 cards. 3 from the Sacrificial Lamb and 1 from your Wrath of the Forest. Now, Wrath of the Forest, I don't really use it for defensive purposes. It's got 4 durability, so it'll last a little while, and 1 defense, which will help you in some situations, but it is utmost and primarily a draw engine, which is very important because Wolvens in Call of the Crystals do not have an effective unilateral draw engine. You kind of have to throw things away to get those cards, and this is the primary card for that. You may not have seen it in very many of my decks, but it is definitely a force to be looked at and is good in a wide array of decks for varying heroes, and is definitely a card you want to purchase early on for general use. It's good for Hunters and Wolfen, by the way. So if you're interested in any of those, definitely look at that card, consider it. As far as directions I'd go with this deck, personally, I don't feel the need for 4 Deathmage Thaddiuses. In fact, I would consider dropping it down to 2 in the future. That way you can include more fatties, such as a 4th Shadow Knight, or maybe a one-off Ogloth if you're really interested in that. Personally, I'm not too interested in Ogloth. I find him a little bit cumbersome. A good fatty that can work in this deck if you're really good with utilizing your stealth abilities is the Brutal Minotaur. I'm going to go ahead and hop on over to him. The Brutal Minotaur, which is a really cool little card that I personally don't utilize that often, is one of the few cards that I've actually gotten foils of, oddly enough. I've gotten 2 of them. A card I never use. I get 2 foils. Go figure. It's a very large ally for very cheap. It does have the side effect of you taking 2 damage if it dies, but it can pretty much one-shot any other ally except for maybe Aeon and Sandworm. It is a force to be reckoned with, and it will pound away at enemy allies in a heartbeat. And you can have as many of them out as you want. They are a fairly interesting addition. Another fatty that you could include that would be good for pounding the ground is the Molten Destroyer. Although with your stealth ability, you're not going to really get the full effect of his kind of deterrent to attack, which is the 1 damage and sets allies on fire. I mean, he burns them to crisps. Kind of funny card art, but we'll deal with that. He's a very good ally, but he's a better fatty for other decks. I'm going to go ahead and load up Ogloth here so you can take a look at him. Now, Ogloth is kind of a good one-off card in some decks, because if you can keep him around and keep him from getting captured preyed and boost his attack up, he's able to kill off small allies. Whenever he launches on the field, he's able to take off 1 cost and 2 cost allies to boost himself. As he gets bigger, he's able to take off bigger allies. Now, there are no allies over 6 cost, so once he reaches a 7 attack, he can pretty much kill any ally in one shot, giving you tremendous board control if you can keep him around. He's one of those cards that you throw down and people will most often just straight up remove from your choices. So yeah, he's not too strong in this deck, but he is definitely something that you can look at as an option. Now, there are a few mid-range options for this deck. For example, the Cobra Demon, which you can use to help maintain a bit of board control, because the shadow ability associated with this allows you to poison allies kind of from a distance. In 1 turn, you can use a Cobra Demon to poison 2 enemy allies, which will slowly drain them down and get them off the board. Now, as far as whether I actually appreciate this card in this deck, not really. You need a lot more damage later on as you are building this deck up. I feel that the curve kind of leads towards the low end, whereas the playstyle of this deck leads towards wanting to get to the high end. Some other cards that you may consider removing, like I said earlier, the Pack Wolves. They're a good 2-drop, but they're just essentially about on par with Pewins, because you're not going to be able to keep enough of them around to fully take advantage of the +1 attack. Some other things you may look at is possibly removing the item destruction, although it does come in handy a lot with this deck for controlling the opponent. Sacrificial Lamb is definitely useful in this deck, although you could look at Bad Santa if you don't mind your opponent getting a little bit of draw out of that, or even looking at Wolven Tracker. I did have quite a bit of success removing the Pack Wolves and replacing them with Wolven Trackers, although Wolven Trackers are more expensive, so you're not going to be able to get them with the strategy that Raphael sets forth on his thread, which I'm going to link down below. I forget if I said that earlier. It's a really good thread for new players and even some experienced players who just don't have the cards that they want. It's a good way to get set up really cheap in this game. It can even give you a concept of a buying path should you not want to spend actual money, or should you want to use surveys or something like that to get shadow crystals. It just gives you that alternative. The Wolven Tracker I like as a replacement for the Sacrificial Lamb, because with the hiding ability, you can usually buy the Wolven Tracker at least 1 or 2 more turns to get you just that little bit of extra draw. Some utility cards that you could consider looking at. Lone Wolf, not very good in this deck, because you usually do not want to be ally-less, although Regeneration may be an optional throw-in if you have the space. It's good for a little quick heal and can keep you in the fight for a little while longer while you struggle to bring out your bigger threats and build up shadow energy and stuff like that to help stretch you into that late game where this deck tends to shine a little bit more. Full Moon, I personally do like it in this deck because it preserves your hero and gives you the same boost as Bloodlust for just 1 resource more. It's a good hiding ability. Some people will see it and assume, oh, you're a Moonstalker. No, it's actually a decent little card. It's underappreciated in my opinion, and I've only really seen it frequently used in Moonstalkers and in Lone Wolves. And I really do wish I'd see it more in traditional Moonstalkers. Here Be Monsters is another good choice for switching out with the Sac Lamb. It doesn't give you quite as much draw. It doesn't give you anywhere near as much draw, honestly. but it also delays your opponent slightly, which can be an advantage. I personally don't do it, but you can look at it. Pack Alpha, not really worthwhile in this deck. I wish there was more use for Pack Alpha. It's kind of a card that's awesome in concept, but not really able to be utilized efficiently. Evil Ascendant, not worth it. Bloodstone Altar, your allies are not going to stick around and be hurt for long enough for that to be worth it either. Acid Jet is an alternative to some of the item removal, although it only works on certain things. You don't want Rain Delay, that's purely a Moonstalker thing. As far as other cards, you can look at Selfishness for an option, kind of a drop-in if you're running into a lot of Aeons, but truth be told, it's not going to really help you much in the long run. Although it would be a good combo on an Aeon if you use Selfishness and Captured Prey on it, but that's 2 cards to disable 1 card. Of course, you're also disabling all of your opponent's Aeons. Not really worth it, but it's kind of interesting to look at. You can put in more shadow fonts as well. This is something that I do whenever I tweak this deck for more regular play. I put in more shadow fonts because I love the ability to kind of sneak in a hide there. Gives you a little more staying power. Bazaar, again, not really good for this deck. You want the unilateral draw rather than the bilateral draw. Bad Santa, same situation, although you can control the conditions of that. Crescendo, really popular among Millstalkers and can honestly be used by this deck to an extent, although by doing so you're giving up your card draw tools. Not ideal. Leyline Nexuses, if I'm going to stick with item destruction, it's going to be a 2/2. Now, as far as weapons go, you don't really have much that you can do a lot with. I mean, you can look at Jeweler's Dream. If you're willing to cut back a little bit on your support cards, Jeweler's Dream can help you accelerate your deck a little bit. But with the way this deck plays, the only time that's going to be really useful is kind of mid-game if you happen to get a bunch of behemoths out, because it'll let you stretch their ability a little bit further. Again, I prefer that with the Lone Wolf, because with the Lone Wolf, the Dark Claw setup. With Dark Claw, you can boost it, you have Speed Strike, and you have the ability to boost your allies with the resources you get from this. That is more of a combative Dark Claw, and I will be trying to cover one of those in the near future. It's a interesting concept that's really hard to balance, and overall Moonstalker is just better at the ally game than Dark Claw, because he has, well, the ability that helps them. You have a couple things here. You have Sliver of Shadow. When it's summoned, your shadow, you lose 1 shadow energy. Really not useful for this guy. Although, if I remember correctly, there is a Dark Prophecies card that's coming out that may find its way into this kind of deck, because it allows you to gather shadow energy instead. Of course, there is the armor here, but that's really not useful because you take damage from it. Honestly, if the shadow armor didn't have that damage clause on it, I think it would be one of the top armors in the game. I would personally like to see something similar to it, except with 1 durability. I mean, not 1 durability, 1 armor, and the ability to gain shadow energy whenever they die without taking damage. But that's just me. Fangs of the Predator. If you're going a weapon route, again, you're better off with Dark Claw. And there's my one and only sleeve, because I wanted to see what they looked like. You guys can mock it all you want. Now, I haven't really talked much about tweaking the low end of the allies in this, because there are a few things. This deck honestly works better with the bigger allies, because you can hide them and bring them into play with a bit more force than a deck without the ability to hide its allies or haste its allies. But on the low end, we do have Bad Wolf. Bad Wolf is a good kind of extra support in the 3-drop for Infernal Gargoyle if you decide to go with the low end focus. If you go with the low end focus, you're going to usually want at least 6 3-drop allies, if not 8 or even 10 or 12. With this deck currently sitting at 8, if you drop out the Thaddeus for some Bad Wolves, that's not going to be a bad trade-off, because Death Mage Thaddeus is being unique. You can only drop out 1 at a time. I wouldn't bother with 1 drop, the Fire Snake. Yeah, they are OP, but they don't work too well in this deck because you don't have a lot of boosting abilities. The Dark Flare, again, it's a 2-drop, not really ideal, but it does have Defender, meaning it can stick around through certain setups. Unfortunately, as a wolf, you do not have a way to boost them up to 3, meaning that they get taken out by Pewins rather readily. Belladonna is an alternative draw engine. She is a 4-drop, but she's very fragile. I don't like her in a lot of decks, but she is a little bit more useful in this deck than she would be in pretty much any other Shadow deck. She can be useful in Portal decks as well. I wouldn't bother with either of the undead guys. Keldor, I personally prefer Deathbone as far as the 3-drop skeletons go. But that's a different discussion. That's more of a Gravebone discussion. Chimera, however you want to pronounce it. Or Chimera is another one, I believe. Not really useful in this deck, although he can pull off some surprise moves. I wouldn't really bother with him in the future. Yes, I did skip the Hellsteed. I like them in large groups. I don't like them alone, so they're generally mitigated to gold farming. Let's see. There is going to be a match release soon that I did show off the Cobra Demon in. Well, I didn't show it off, but an opponent showed off why it can be a little bit threatening. They just didn't utilize it to its full potential. And I think that's most of what I wanted to cover. The Carnivore, not useful for this unless you have What Big Teeth out to soften them first, in which case you can start growing Carnivores. They're still easily disabled and retreated, though. I personally would not go for a 4th Now You're Mine. In fact, I usually cut it back to 2 whenever I'm running it, or I just completely eliminate them. Rabid Bite. I don't like this card. But at the same time, I do like this card. It's a card that... it's Mind Control's weaker, kind of gimpy little brother. Because it doesn't automatically attack the hero, and it doesn't remove the ally as a complete threat, it just disables it for 1 turn, so you have to deal with it while it's disabled. Don't like it. It could have been better, but it's not. And I have rambled on about pretty much every card available to Wolvens, which is not what my original intention was, but I think it will provide informative to some people who are interested in more ally-centric builds, as well as people who are interested in just getting started in the game, since this is a relatively easy deck to afford. I mean, you can get it through some grinding, which, come to think of it, I should probably cover a gold grinding deck. It's a 30-card deck that basically focuses on killing AI opponents, and it'll work up until the AI is updated. So I might cover that soon as well, just so people can start gathering the cards for a little bit more competitive decks. This deck, I wouldn't expect it to carry you into the top ranks, but as it is, it can work up into the low 200s, maybe, depending on your play style. If you can, you might be able to tweak out the mid 200s with it. But it's a good deck, it's solidly built, and it's a good way to demonstrate proper Moonstalker play rather than kind of griefy, negative player experience kind of play. So yeah, that's been Moonstalker, the Majere version, and the starter player version. So yeah, keep gaming, have fun, peace out. If you enjoy my Shadow Era commentary, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, give your opinions on this deck. I am interested in seeing other people's experience with it, since it is fairly well known. So yeah, keep gaming, have fun, peace out. See you next time. Bye.